We've allowed the cancer of relativism to infect us, so we think there are no shared universal values, and there is no freedom without those shared universals.
Vrijheid is iets wat je niet kan waarderen wanneer je het helemaal hebt. Je moet het een tijdje niet hebben en dan pas begrijp je wat je mist.
Reverse the question, can art destroy the world? And I think it can. You can choose either to be abused or not.
The political news is robust. The safety of journalists.
We hacked into the audience, and then all of a sudden 300 phones would ring, you know.
Good evening, everybody. Warm welcome. Welcome in the Balie. Great that you're all here with so many people on your free Wednesday night, just before the December activities commence. You've all chosen to be here on your free night. I think you've chosen rightly so, because this is a special night also for me. My name is Tim Wagemakers. I'm program editor at the Balie. And across the year, you get to hear many people speak. And while you hear interesting stuff all the time, there are very rare moments when you get the chance to meet people that are like, well, a bit the seismographs of our time. They are able to feel the pulse of where we come from. They can say something about where we are right now. And if you listen really carefully, you can also get a glimpse of where we're heading in the future, maybe, or some scenarios. And one of these persons is Saskia Sassen, who is here tonight. She just flew in this morning from New York, so thank you, Saskia, for making this work in your schedule. Really happy that you're here. And you are all part of the series Long Live Amsterdam, or in Dutch, Leve Amsterdam. This is the second edition, actually. Last month we had Evgeny Morozov talking about how technologies shape the city. Next month we have former mayor of Bristol, George Ferguson, talking about the resilient city. How can a city cope with all the big transformations that are coming towards them? And tonight we have Saskia Sassen. And I think her story is more relevant than ever for Amsterdam. Because if you talk about Amsterdam, I don't know how it is with you, but sometimes you get the feeling that people fear that people are being expelled from the city. The question is, who is able to live in the city, and who, moreover, more important, is able not to live in the city anymore. And when we take as a fact that Amsterdam is growing the coming years, what trends, what systemic edges are there, and how can we analyze them in terms of those who can participate and those who are left out? These are all questions we will address tonight. And the reason we wanted to do this is because we have municipal elections in March. And sometimes debates about Amsterdam can be a bit repetitive. It's like a closed circuit where you have the same opinions of the same people. And while they are interesting, we thought it would be nice to invite foreign thinkers to breathe some air into those discussions with tonight Saskia Sassen. Just to remind you, her story, which she's going to tell, is not some tailor-made blueprint on Amsterdam. That will be a bit strange from someone who's not living in Amsterdam. But the reason I think, and the Balie thinks, that we should listen to her story is because if you listen to it, I think it says something about the way we should think about the future of our city and the questions we should ask when we discuss the future of our city. So don't expect a whole analysis of Airbnb and whether the amount of days should be 30 or 60, but we try to get underneath the symptoms maybe and look at the systems that shape our city. Saskia Sassen will give a lecture, after which I've asked Professor, I need to say it right, Urban and Regional Planning, Sef Hemel, to talk with the three of us in a panel discussion. Sef Hemel is also one of those experts who combines expertise, which you need as an expert, with vision, I guess. And he has a clear view of Amsterdam, that we should not see it as a world village, but as a world city, and act accordingly. My job is quite humble tonight. It's my job to guide them through the night. Saskia Sassen has a really busy schedule, so we have until 9:45, and I've reserved also some time at the end for your questions. So if you hear anything interesting or something you want your eyebrows get raised by, please lock it up and we'll get to that at the end of the discussion. And at 9:45, I'll make sure you'll be at the bar for some drinks. So let's start right away. Saskia Sassen, I think, is one of the most, well, I don't know if it's a word actually, globalized persons. I mean, she travels across the globe 9 times a year, I guess. And she teaches sociology at the Columbia University. She wrote many books, among which The Global City, but also the book Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity in the Global Economy, which is really a must-read if you want to understand.
Is this in Dutch, you know?
Yes.
It's in Dutch.
That's a good...
Oh, okay.
Yeah. yeah. Well, you can also read it in Dutch. It's also in French, I guess.
It's in 18 languages.
18 languages. So if you can pick and choose and compare them if you want to.
Yeah, because they vary, right?
Well, tonight she talk about the future of cities, about global cities, and maybe also hint a bit towards something we might underestimate in Amsterdam, namely land grabs by major corporations. So give her a warm hand of applause. Saskia Sassen.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. I've been here many times over, I don't know, how long does the Balie exist? 20 years? 35 years, and I was here 35 years ago too, I'm sure. But it's really a pleasure to be here, and I very much enjoy talking with Sef Hemel. Now, I want to start with this notion as a framing of what are the main dynamics that are reshaping. In other words, we still have old dynamics too, that are reshaping not just cities, but also our economies, you know, a multiplicity of strategic sites that constitute our economic, social, not so much cultural, but certainly economic and social condition within which we exist. And again, one organizing logic for me is this notion of the rise of extractive logics. And let me very briefly explain what I mean by that. So yes, mining is extractive, but so is Nestle and Coca-Cola, who go around the world extracting water and killing land that way and then selling it for a very high price. But so is also high finance, which is radically different from traditional banking. The traditional bank is commerce. It sells something it has for a price. High finance, radically different from the traditional banking. One way of framing it, high finance sells something it does not have. And in selling what it does not have, it becomes extractive. It has to get it from somewhere, since it does not have it. And the other feature about high finance, which I see as sort of one of the dominant logics that make for this extractive mode, is that it can really work with negatives. For instance, student debt in the United States is now over $1 trillion. The traditional bank may think, oh, $1 trillion, that sounds pretty, but it's negative, it's debt. They don't know what to do with it. Finance, $1 trillion, I can work with that. Plus, just to sort of underline it, they succeeded in making our Congress pass a law that says this is debt that can never be excused, you know, or cancelled. So finance can work with that trillion for a long time. So to understand finance, you know, it really takes, you have to somehow do some strange things to your brain, because it shouldn't work that way. It does work that way. Another datum, global GDP, all the countries in the world, including the US, including China, all the biggies, it's quite a bit less than $100 trillion. The value of high finance, as measured by what is the typical measure, which is outstanding derivatives, is over $1 quadrillion. That's many more zeros, and they're all working. I mean, $1 quadrillion is... So the thing that tells you is that finance is not about money. And one of the issues that I want to focus on tonight is the way in which the financial system has entered a whole new zone, which is about buildings, mostly big buildings. And an image that I give you just in shorthand now. When you are in Manhattan, you see a lot of towers, beautiful towers, some new, some old, that are empty. They are dark at night. Most people who see that, they say, oh, poor investors. They built this building and now it's empty. No. That building, because it is empty, is delivering more goods to the financial sector than if there were people living in it. Because that building can function as a kind of reservoir of assets, like a field, you know, where you throw in all those fancy buildings, so to say, and then they can extract a bit of that materiality and produce an asset-backed security, which they can buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell in one day. They make much more money off that empty, fancy building than if they were renting it out. Now, that, I hope that this was clear what I said, that alters the whole game. One little item that I want to pull out of that is the notion that density, that kind of density, tall buildings with multiple floors, multiple windows, that type of density, which in the past, if you said density, that must be a city. Well, this type of density actually de-urbanizes a city because it's empty, because it's hollow, and because, of course, it raises the price of all land. You know, that is a secondary issue. So I want to arrive at this, which I just explained, but I want you to keep that in mind, if possible. And I want to start out with a somewhat more generic element. And just to justify it, in case there are academics, etc. here, but I also love saying this, that expose, I have come to understand that my zone for research, for interpretation, etc., is something that is probably best described as a zone before method. Now, that is partly because I think that existing methods worked, you know, I would say in the West, broadly understood West, until about the 1980s. They worked fine. They captured critical dynamics in our economies. I think a lot of those methods in the social sciences, including in economics, no longer work to capture what is actually going on, to make it accessible to us. And in that sense, I think it's a period where we need to try to discover, we need to experiment, we need to bring in methodologies that open up onto other elements. Every method has a zone of strength, and it can leave out a lot. So in that sense, you know, the zone, I love this notion of before method. It doesn't mean that you throw method out of the window, but still. And one way of thinking about it is a tactical analytics. Tactical. You're trying to actually understand something, rather than being dutiful, you know, vis-a-vis whatever the existing orders. Now, here are some of these strategies. I just want to mention one. I find that one practice that we need to sort of engage in, and most people engage in, except if you are, you know, maybe a social scientist who's trying to do some very specific research, is a need to actively destabilize some of our core concepts. Think of the economy. The economy today is totally different from when we were in the Keynesian period, you know, before the 1980s, really. The middle classes. Well, the middle classes have split up. One is doing extremely well, much better than they ever thought, and another part is much poorer. You know, and you can just go on and on. The government, the national blah, blah, whatever. These are all meanings that have lost capacity to explain. So we really need to sort of develop these, one way of putting it is these analytic tactics, or this tactical analytics that allows you to actually position yourself vis-a-vis the object of study the way your mind tells you, give it a try, sort of a more experimental mode. Now, let me start with an image. we make, and I don't mean the makers movement, I just mean we make. So we made this astounding. In 20 years, we killed one of the biggest internal seas, the Aral Sea. That's an accomplishment. I, by the way, think that capability, that's a capability. Capability which comes with this heavy positive connotation. Capability should also capture negatives, and it does. So when I say this is a capability, I mean it also in that sense. Now, it is extraordinary that it took only 20 years to kill this very large internal ocean. This is even more impressive. 1 billion years, poof, gone in 20 years. So that I'm working on a project now on the notion of simple key codes, such as those that were used to destroy those two oceans and so many other things. Simple key codes, but on a positive vector. How do we begin to think of ourselves as capable of making, of constructing, of building, of designing instruments that can reshape parts of our economy, parts of how we use the environment, etc., etc. And again, staying within a simple frame, very different from putting, the station in interstellar space. That is not simple knowledge. Nor are financial instruments simple knowledge. They're also complex. But there is a lot of good stuff, so this notion of making, but not in the sense of the makers movement, something a bit different. So a framing. How do complex systems change? And it seems to me that this is a question we need to ask to understand our current moment. Secondly, I've really engaged with this question in my book, the territory book, Territory Authority Rights, which took me 10 years or 9 years to write. That was at the University of Chicago. I became a monk. Monk different from nun, But I just was lost. That is a very peculiar university, University of Chicago. I don't know if people are aware, but it is the best. And so it seems to me that the way complex systems change, and I think it is important if we think about conditions that need to be transformed, where we might just be participants in that transformation, it seems to me that complex systems change not by changing everything, or by making the foundational elements of that transformation visible. There is a real ambiguity. I think often they change by shifting capabilities organized in time one in a certain way to time two, where they get reorganized, but it is invisible. I think a lot of the negatives that I'm going to talk about have a kind of invisibility that attaches to them. It's not self-evident what has happened. You actually need an explanation. And when we think of change, it doesn't mean changing everything. Often it means simply taking what functioned in a certain way in time one, say the traditional bank, which was commerce, it sold you money, which you needed for a price, an interest rate, versus finance, which many people think is more or less banking, and it absolutely is not. A foundational transformation that to the average citizen is a bit invisible. Okay, fine, the financial firms call themselves banks also. Foundationally different elements. When you have a few of those somewhat invisible shifts of capabilities from one model to another model, you can have a foundational transformation that is not quite visible. And I would say that after the 1980s, we really entered a new period. It took decades for that new period to emerge in its fullness, but now we have had it for about 20 years, I would say, at least, if not more. Now, and so within that framing, then we might ask, what is the steam engine of our epoch? Now, the steam engine was something that changed a lot of things. It did not change everything. In fact, at that time, when the factories were there in Manchester, etc., in England, if you would have taken a little plane flying over England, and you would have seen that sheep on top of a green hill, you would have said, "Ooh, England, what a nice rural economy." But no, that sheep was already part of a different circuit, which was the factories in the cities. It was an industrial sheep, nothing to do with a rural sheep. So again, the notion that these transformations in complex systems are not very visible. Now, it seems to me that if I ask myself that question, what is the steam engine of our epoch? That which changed something, significant change, but not everything. In other words, a lot looked like it was the same. To me, that is finance. And I want to be very quick here. I just invite you to look at, oh, this doesn't have a little, it doesn't have a, yeah. Look at this. This is 6 years from 2001, below $1 trillion, to 2007, 62 trillion. Think of anything that can acquire that change in valuation in 6 years. I checked, nothing. Further, these 62 trillion was already then more than global GDP, which was at 56 trillion at this point. That includes China, the US, etc. Finally, these 62 trillion is only 10% of the value of high finance at that point, which was 600 trillion. Today, it's over a quadrillion, as I said already. And all those zeros are working. And it's a lot of zeros, you can imagine, right? So what are we looking at here? This is a capability, a dangerous one, clearly. And the thing that I get to at very soon now is this question that this is a capability that is now having a ball, just a great time, entering the city, the urban, buildings, etc., etc. And at that point, it intersects. I'm sorry, I'm not totally well. At that point, it intersects with all of us. All of us is a manner of speech, but you know, with the city. I'm going to skip this. So finance as a capability with direct and indirect pathways. So I want to just give you these are all elements of our contemporary condition that I want to share with you. And eventually I get to the buildings and the city. So one thing is the Vulture Funds. I would just love to hear how many of you have heard of what is so gently called Vulture Funds. Anybody? Vulture Funds? Okay, so I see some. So here is an example. I'm just going to skip this. This is all much too much. But here's an example then. So look at this. So Panama takes on a debt of, this is the first case in this modern moment here, for 17 million. The Vulture Funds, complicated story that doesn't matter, but this is just yet another mechanism that is extractive. Take to Panama to court. That's sovereign debt. I'm just talking sovereign debt. Sovereign debt is special debt because it's a people's debt, so to speak. You know, we the people don't mostly produce it, but it's considered special. They're sued, and now we have, you know, dozens and dozens of these cases. They're sued in a regular court in New York, a commercial court, where the judge said, yes, I will accept this case, breaking rules that have existed for a very long time, where sovereign debt is handled differently than commercial debt. And Panama is forced to pay, and does pay, 57 million secretly. Peru, 11.4, 58 million. They learned, my God, we can extract more and more. And just to get at Argentina, they bought $48 million of Argentinian debt. That was a portion of Argentinian debt. Took it to court. This just happened. Some of you may be aware of this. And they got 2.3 billion. This is an extractive logic. They have developed very nice instruments to get there. So just to give you a sense that when it comes to the financializing of buildings, you know, this is one element in a sequence of elements. Here is another extractive mode. I have to stand here. So This is something that was dressed in the clothing of a mortgage for modest income households. Because at this point, most Americans sort of owned their house. But you had about 30% who did not, 20%, 25%. So they built an instrument that supposedly, for no advance payment, you could sort of buy a house and then be paying probably for the rest of your life, but still, a good deal, so to speak. The result was foreclosures, foreclosures, foreclosures. 16.5 million contracts were signed in a period of 6 years. 14+ million households went broke, like 3 years after, 4 years after. Now, you stand back, you look at those two figures that I just mentioned, total of 16 million, almost all, 14.5 million, etc., went broke. Smart financiers would say, oh my God, we did it wrong, etc. No. It was never about houses. The way to think about it is a big field where you throw in all those modest houses, it's assets, it's materiality. And then you produce asset-backed securities for the high finance sector, which at that point was tired with derivatives. Don't you give me any more derivatives. A derivative can be a derivative based on another derivative. Give me an asset-backed security. Leave the derivatives for the silly people, the mass. Oh, they can do all the derivatives. Not with us. So what they produced was a fiction of a mortgage, a house mortgage. And you have to really, some of you at least, should find out that this is not happening, because this instrument has entered Europe. Number one, Germany. Million households out. So the point of all of this is a fiction dressed as a mortgage, because a mortgage is a respectable instrument. But the purpose is, I need materialities. Anything will do, the toilet, asset-backed, the wall, 3 parts of whatever. Now, here you see it. So here is Europe. And this, by the way, this goes on and on. So Germany, these are all households that have been subjected to this, and they basically lose everything. Because it is not about providing housing. It just dresses itself. That instrument has been declared illegal in the United States because it was so extreme. And now it's traveling. Wait till it hits India, China. It's probably already functioning in China. That is my reading, but I don't know. All right. One little other element. And this comes back, the real framing that I'm interested in here is the importance of relocalizing. Relocalizing what we can localize. So my rhetorical question is, if I want a cup of coffee in my neighborhood, do I really depend on a multinational for my cup of coffee? I shouldn't, right? That can be produced locally. If it's a computer, yeah, I need a franchise, right? A franchise is at a meaning, right? You understand? So with the computers, you need a franchise, otherwise you have to go to the factory. But do we really need all these multinationals that are franchising all over, killing local? How do we return to that locality? Those are all extractive modes. Now here, in that spirit, this is a very peculiar period for Eastern Europe, because it is when they are really, after having been, I put it in quotation marks, liberated, they then enter this other system. Now look at this. So first the title. Ratio of household credit to personal disposable income. Credit sounds really pretty. It's dead. I don't know, I mean, the language, because I don't speak one language well, and I speak in 6 languages, I'm always engaged by language, I will say. Now, so this is a critical period for these countries, especially. Look, let's take Hungary. Hungary had a debt, household debt, 11%. The United States was already at 104. Then Hungary, 5 years later, that debt is up to almost 40%. I'm sure that this kind of stuff is also happening here. I'm not 100% sure, but I think so. Now, in the meantime, the United States was already 132%. Now look at Germany. 70, 70, might as well be 70, 70, 70. An incredible stability. Huh? Germany really has a way of running. Now, back here. So Hungary. So when I see this, first question I ask myself is not what went wrong with that household, what are they doing accumulating all this debt? I want to know who owns that Hungarian debt. If that Hungarian debt, or Czech debt, or whatever, is owned by a local bank, and I say bank, not financial institution, by a local bank, you might say, okay, the local bank has a good interest return on that loan, they can create a new job, you know, give employment to some locals. You know, there is a kind of a positive multiplier. Commerce, you know, in the best sense of that word. So I went and checked. By the way, I recommend highly the IMF staff papers. The IMF staff papers are unpublished, but you have free access to them. Most people don't know this. The IMF data is our data. We, the citizens of the world, pay for a good part of what is done there. And I recommend to everybody, check out the IMF staff papers, because they really have very good data, you know, that sort of often gets close to sort of people's concerns. Now, so I checked out the debt. Hungary, 40% of that debt was owned by foreign banks. German, Swiss, and Austrian. I don't know why the Germanic vector is in there. That is not so great. It's not because it's German that it's not so great. It's just because it's a foreign bank. Because that means that the capacity to pay an interest rate of that locality, whoop, most of it leaves. That interest payment goes straight even to another country. It would be the same if it were a big national bank that just takes it out rather than... So this notion of relocalizing some of what today functions at the level of franchises, I think is critical, and it's critical for cities, because cities are sort of the main playing ground for all of that. I hope that this is clear what I've been saying. Now, in short, one thing that you can extract from that, extractive sectors can extract even from modest households, because you're dealing with many numbers. Now here's yet another extractive mode. I can't even remember what I wrote here, but let's see. All right, now we get to the... Now I'm doing a study looking at the top 100 cities, and it varies from year to year, more or less, that are, one way of putting it, the object of desire of investors. And so the figures that I'm going to give you, and I can only reach the 10th because, you know, it'd take too long. We'll go around the whole building. So these are just acquisitions of existing buildings. These are not, these are not anything. It's just existing buildings, not new construction. New construction is also happening. But as you can see, so this was 1 year, 2013 to 2014, New York was $55 trillion, just buying just that 1 year, you know, every year, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see, I thought I had one where I had, let me see. Now, when you look at foreign investment, London is number 1. And again, there I have the figures. And here is Amsterdam, Randstad. And this is one of the highest. You see, the highest rates of growth. I don't have any negative here, but even when it's negative, it just can still be a positive, but it's just much less than the prior year. You understand the notion, right? And so, what are they buying? I mean, that's a big jump. You must have noticed something or not. I mean, I don't know what they're buying, but, you know... And then again, Shenzhen. So at one point, Beijing was much more, you know, than Shenzhen. But these are rates of growth. They're not necessarily the absolute amount. You understand, right? So the amount is still bigger in London, even though the rate of growth compared to the prior year is much lower. But Amsterdam certainly has become an object of desire. You must have picked up on that. I'm sure you have. Now here's something that I want to explain. I did this just mostly for the case of Germany. So as you can see, Berlin in 2015 had 11 million coming in, right? And that was a decline, minus 6%. It was still a massive amount, you understand, but it was compared to the prior year. And you see that Hamburg is rising, right? So the figures also show you what are the cities that they are done with a bit. They're still investing a lot, they're still higher rank, but also what are the emergent ones. And when you really look at the details, you can see that they are crawling. They start with Berlin, but then they move on to more and more cities, including Hamburg, which is, after Munich, etc. Hamburg has the highest rate of growth. Whereas the total amount of money might still be, in Berlin and in some of these others. So that is just to clarify the numbers. Now, if you look at the total buying of buildings in these top 100 cities, it was $600 billion in that 2014 to 2015. It goes from mid to mid, and from 2015 to 2016 it was over $1 trillion. So you also see in the overall, this is all the cities, the 100 cities. And some cities drop out, but most of them are in there. And then it went up. Now, these top 100 cities, okay, so it's a particular framing, which in 5 years you may need to change 50% of those cities in that list. They might be the top. And so it's a movable animal, if you want. So they represent 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world's GDP, 76% of property investment. Now, this is the language that is used. It's deceptive language. And that is why I put it like this. What it really is a financializing. So 76% of property investment, 76% of those properties that were financialized, which is not all properties. If you look at all properties that are being sold and bought in the world, you get a completely different map. This is a very specific vector that involves most major cities in the world. But so I just want to make sure that it is clear that have been financialized. And once they are financialized, I repeat what I said a bit earlier, they can be used in many, you can keep on building instruments. It's a different mode of measuring the advantage, the money, the earnings involved, than just, the price of a house or of a building. This is a financialized asset. Now, furthermore, according to this is not my data here, according to Seville's, and they know what they are doing. So I was trying to get some data on Phnom Penh. Phnom Penh, they're buying, and I was having a hard time. The experts didn't have the data. Seville's did. So according to Seville's, I just emphasize, worldwide real estate assets, that means financialized, comprise nearly 60% of the value of all global assets. Now, when you say assets, you are excluding derivatives, you are excluding all kinds of fancy financial instruments. You're talking about, to some extent, the real thing, to some extent. But as a financialized, it's a bit complicated, but this is what is happening. So includes equities, bonds, and gold. It does not include derivatives. It does not include, et cetera, et cetera. So 217 trillion. 217 trillion is almost 3 times global GDP. That is just buildings, financialized buildings. So what I then wind up with is saying, my God, if you look at buildings and the fact that you have in most countries of the world today, most, not all, a rising class of very wealthy families, etc., individuals, all over, in many, many countries, you have that, you have the super rich that have always been there, and then you have that rising class that is not the super rich, but they're rich. They're really rich. And that can be up to 30. In Manhattan, it's up to 30%. That is, again, not the 1%, that's the 30%. And for a city, that makes it very visible. That is a strong presence. If you have 40% or 30% of your families, for instance, or of individual households, are very rich. That means that they take over space. So in Manhattan, we have seen massive departures of middle classes, professors, etc., who simply cannot afford to live there. Today in Silicon Valley, you have a lot of people who are making a lot of money, but not enough to buy a house. They're mostly very young people also, so they live in cars, they live in tents. I mean, these are extreme cases in a way, but they're capturing a reality that I'm afraid is not going away. And now, of course, I'm very much looking forward to your talk, what is happening here in Amsterdam also, or in the Netherlands generally. I want to make a final, how much more time do I have? Okay, so a final sort of set of comments. And that is the question of what does this all look like? So this is London. You see the river there, central London, etc. I had to walk there with a journalist who wanted to do an interview with me, sort of, he had read some of my stuff. And I realized that I hadn't quite spent much time in this area. This is very central London. These are all very beautiful buildings. And so I heard the tourists say, oh, look at these beautiful British buildings. And I don't know why, but I needed to check out, so really who owns these buildings? Well, they are all of these buildings are owned by one big Chinese company. I'm not hitting on the Chinese. They are just one, but this just gives you a sense. And so out of that then also comes a concern for me, sort of the theorist a bit. The material condition is losing power to mark a truth or a condition or a fact. And I already mentioned several of these elements as I've spoken. This to me is very interesting. When you have a massive realm that is not simply digitized, there's a lot of stuff that is digitized, but that actually is a whole economic logic of its own that is not visible to the average person. And then that's one thing, but then these houses, they don't tell the story. They all look like nice British houses, except this one, which is really bad. I don't know who the architect is. Now, here, look at this. This, I don't know if you can read it. So this is London property purchased by overseas companies. This is about 50,000 buildings. Let me put it positive, all of these buildings are owned by offshore companies. They're not even London companies. And so then you have to begin, and it's very easy to do that today. It's probably happening right here in Amsterdam and in Utrecht and who knows where all. And so the question is, so what am I seeing? What is this? Many of these are profoundly underused buildings. And again, I come back to this financializing. People think, oh my God, poor owners. No. I think an emergent condition in our cities, and it's a very troubling one, is that an expensive, big, sort of empty building can deliver, as I said at the start, more profits than an occupied building. We will always have occupied buildings because the economy installs itself in buildings, because people need buildings, whatever. But there is that other vector. And the money that it is generating is way above whatever a rent or a home price would be. So I think we need to look out for this stuff. Again, I want to repeat, because it doesn't say here, I thought it said it, none of these buildings is owned by a person, and none of the entities, whatever they're called, that owns them is based in England. They're all in other countries. And this is an extreme case. London is extreme, but it repeats itself. So this is the visuals that we have from New York. These are new built towers, very luxury towers, mostly empty. Here's another one, etc. And here the story is, as when I said at the start, but now maybe you understand, it's clearer. these buildings are likely, almost sure, delivering more profit because they're empty. So what does that tell us about cities and urbanity? That a building is not simply a building, and that many a building will de-urbanize our cities. Thank you very much.
You can take a seat here. Thank you so much for that speech. I think, well, the term follow the money has gained some substance after your speech. I also think that before we ask Zev, because I think you've learned us quite, well, to put on a different looking glass if you look at your city and what lies underneath it. But just one quick question before we go to Zev. If you talk about the debate in Amsterdam of the housing market.
Yeah, I don't know the debate.
Well, many people say that one fear is that we're going towards a London situation.
Do they know what they mean by a London situation? Because the London situation, as I just explained, has multiple layers. But do they mean all of those layers, or?
Well, they mean the foreign investors. Actually, the key point is cities are to live, not to be a money machine.
Right, exactly.
But Amsterdam is not yet there. So what role does local governance, what role does regulations have in turning this dynamic of expulsion into inclusive?
Right. Well, I think that's a very good question. There are several issues here, and there are issues that I have been fighting for a very long time, I must say. Number one is that what I explained to you, I hope, was fairly clear. You understood the logic. Even if you would be looking at the instruments, you would say, what the hell am I looking at? But you understood the logic of the explanation, I hope, right? Yeah. We can understand this stuff. Right now, not enough people are talking about it. Because this is really a form almost, I don't know what image to use, but you know this notion that an empty building is more productive to the owners than a full, it's a bit alarming in a city. All these dark towers, it's really bad stuff, you know. So the one critical element is to understand the logic behind. It's not enough to know all the cases, you must also understand the logic that guides them.
You need the bird's eye view to see the...
That's right. And I think that Amsterdam probably has some of this. I mean, right now, London and New York are the extreme cases, and it's not surprising in a way. But, you know, it's happening in Spain, it's happening in many other countries as well. This is a growing condition.
Because you talked about circuits, you know, that from the 80s we've gotten into a different mode, a transformation.
Yeah.
So cities became, it might be before, they became global cities. Can a city like Amsterdam, when we talk about it, is there a way to shield yourself from these drivers?
I'm glad you asked that. So I alluded to it in passing. I really think we need to, well, first, at the grandest level, we need law. We need to throw out, at least the United States, the Netherlands may be totally different. In the United States, we urgently need to throw out a few old laws. We need to prevent some new laws to be made. This is the law has become a football game in the United States. We urgently need new law. So we have a few senators, for instance, like, you know, well-known people who have made a difference because they have their knowledge. One of the issues for me is the political classes. Yes, we need your average member of society who is not an expert on anything, but we also need to cover critical issues, because when you frame it all in terms of these extractive logics, it really is worrisome.
Yeah.
Where will it end? You know, what is next? Yeah. I mean, if now an empty building is more profitable than an occupied building, I mean, where are we? You know what? So there is there are many sectors that need to get involved. The citizenry, they can understand what I just explained. They know, okay, there is a high risk here, etc. They can push for new types of legislation that makes a halt to this. Finance has got to be separated from traditional banking, as it used to be in the United States, at least. I mean, etc., etc. So there are multiple fronts in which this battle. But for me, one project that I'm deeply involved in is, what can we relocalize? Everything has become a franchise, more or less. And a franchise is an extractive mode. Again, sometimes we need it, like with a computer, that example that I made, right? But
not for your local coffee.
But we don't need it for my local coffee. We don't need it for so many things. We need to begin to relocalize. Relocalizing also means, I mean, Europe is much better than the US. So the US is an extreme case. It means to bring in the poor. The poor are as smart as we are. They may not have the same knowledge as we are, but they're smart. Their intelligence is, and people should really become actively engaged in their city. The city is our space. There are spaces where we, the average citizen, we're out. But the city is one of the spaces, where we can actually...
That's a good sentence to maybe look at Amsterdam and introduce Sef Hemel. He's Professor Urban and Regional Planning at the UvA. He's one of the people who helped the city of Amsterdam develop a strategy for 2030 or 40, was it? 40? So give him a warm welcome, Sef Hemel. Sef, I need some help. Because I've listened to Saskia's story and I'm in desperate need of some elements that are relevant for Amsterdam and the situation here.
Wow.
How did you listen to it and what elements are important for us when we look at Amsterdam?
Well, this is so we need a lot of help of all of the audience, and even the citizens, I think, should help us. And to begin with, I don't feel I don't have any expertise on this whole real estate market and what is happening, but I have read your books, of course. No, then you should have invited a person like my colleague Ewald Engelen, the financial geographer. He knows much more about it.
But if you look at the housing market...
For the city, you speak about the city.
For the city, I will. But I first wanted to know the way you presented this logic.
Yeah.
It sounded almost evil.
I think it is a bit evil.
But
It's not. But yeah.
But first, Seth, you can ask your question. But first, I want you to say something about Amsterdam and why this story relates to us and how we look at the city's future and how we deal with our housing and the land.
Well, I'm not that pessimistic about it. I wish I knew more about it. We have no empty buildings.
Good.
Not really.
Good.
Yeah, to begin with.
Yeah. Really.
But we all read in newspapers that there is a lot of activity in the city with buying and selling of real estate. That's what we know. And we know that... Is it working? Yeah. That there is a Dutch prince who owns now hundreds of dwellings.
Who is that? Who is the Dutch prince?
Prince Bernhard.
Junior.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I see.
Well, it's a good addition, yeah.
Yeah, but we know already a lot more about who owns, how this local real estate market functions.
Right.
And I think we need this transparency and this discussion. And already you can feel that the citizens want to know what is going on.
Right.
And also the mayor, the former mayor, because he died last year, he was already worrying, I think some 4 or 5 years ago.
Did he not die of natural causes?
It was, he died of cancer. He was already worrying about what was happening to this real estate. And
they're good for him, really.
Yeah, yes. So I think the citizens are already having become, especially after the financial crisis of 2008, of course, much more activated. And in that sense, I'm very, I would say, I'm much more optimistic, I think, than you.
But we are growing at quite a fast rate.
Yep.
You see that the amount of people that are investing, foreign investors, are growing. That number of 246% was quite amazing. How can we then, because you thought about that also for the city, how can you guide this growth into becoming something that, well, I don't want to be in cliches, but that also the local policeman, the nurse, and the teacher can still live in the city.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Well, what we did, we started in the financial crisis in 2009, 2010, programs for self-built houses. And we offered a lot of plots in the city every year. We bring them to the market. And I hoped it would grow and grow, that it would become really very big. Because the Dutch building industry is very industrial and anonymous. And people the citizens were quite, I would say, really consumers on this housing market. And that they would become more active and that they also would be producers of houses. And this program is still running and it's still growing. And I think this is a very good thing.
Yeah.
Saskia, I'm curious because we have
Can
one...
I just say something on that?
So maybe those buildings, you saw this huge amount, it might be office space. Mostly.
It probably is mostly office space. Though it is true also that one Chinese company bought 14 grachthuizen.
Grachtenpanden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I just invented my Dutch there, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And those I think are marked. They cannot be changed, right? Mm-hmm. Right, those grachthuizen.
Yeah.
Yes. So what are you hinting at?
Yeah.
So there is also a kind of buying that is not necessarily going to mean that you destroy the building, you know, but who knows? Because I think that is sort of interesting that the Chinese are the main, but the reason the Chinese keep coming up is that they are right now the main buyers. The big development bank of China, as some of you know probably, is bigger than the World Bank. You know, so China is really very significantly present in many countries of the world. And the big new project involves 64 countries that they want to sort of engage with, etc. So I think we can fight, number one. Number two, there is a limit of the type of building that would be attractive to these types of investors. Though the notion of tearing down a building that is not, you know, protected and putting up a tower, that is very typical in New York, a bit more difficult in a city like Amsterdam or Utrecht or Rotterdam maybe even, I don't know. But, you know, there is a limit. I see everything as a curve. So at what point, you know, like in a city like Amsterdam, do they actually, they've done the job of buying some of these properties and they move on to another place? Because that's when I look at my 100 cities, you know, they're now moving into cities where they were not in 2 years ago. I'm talking about a certain type of investor. So, but the key thing that I want to recover, also what you were describing about your work, is that the city, to a very large extent, is still the city of a mass of people, even though you have these very powerful actors. So, number one, citizens should be aware of what is happening. But at the same time, I think what you are doing, which is the positive side, which is mobilizing citizens to make it, that is critical precisely because of that negative. That negative can have a huge shadow effect, as it does in Manhattan. And so the city is still a people's city to a very large extent when you just look at the numbers.
And what do you think of the instruments we have in Amsterdam? Because, for example, we have some regulations that more than 30% of what we build should be social housing. We also have this element of ground lease that's quite... I don't think that anyone from London would buy a house or anyone from New York would buy a house that's on ground lease because you own the house but not the ground.
Oh, in London that happens a lot.
Oh, it happens?
But they're changing the law. And they're changing, not changing the law, changing the practice.
But what do you think of these instruments to control your territory, actually, and the houses that are built on it?
Well, I mean, we have older instruments, such around public space questions, that we, the general citizen, doesn't look at the law, etc., which is being abused. So the latest scandal in the case of the UK is that a lot of what presents itself as public space is private space. I don't know if some of you may have picked up on that. So vast stretches of it, people think, this is public space, park, or esplanade, etc. No, it's private. Now, this is now a bit of a scandal in the UK because people have discovered in Manchester, and especially in London, but in a few cities, that this is happening. I don't know if that is happening here. I think that London has always been a more commercial, well, Amsterdam is pretty commercial too, of course. Yeah. But say, I don't know, but all I know is that in a way, your focus is what should be the concern of citizens. In other words, it's our city, and we have to fight back. We cannot be naive. We must understand these negative elements, but that, by God, the majority of people are the citizens of the city, etc., etc. And it's an important. And so, what I was saying that in my research now, I really want to see what can we relocalize in our cities. I'm especially interested in poorer neighborhoods. How can we enable them, with a whole set of instruments? So, I think the battle that we have has two vectors. One is legal experts that can combat that whole abuse, which is beginning to happen because it is truly an abuse. It's absolutely an abuse. On the other hand, the masses of the citizens who share a certain interest, whether they know it or not, whether they talk about it or not, and there, what you have been doing, what you described to me, in Amsterdam about, that is the spirit that we need. That is the kind of logic that we need.
Seth?
He agrees.
I hope so. Yeah. But I'm starting to doubt it after your lecture.
There is a battle.
Seth?
Yeah. What is your scenario for the future? All citizens protesting?
I don't see that happening, regrettably.
No.
I don't, because I think if you ask me, did I interrupt you?
No? No.
Yeah, I interrupted.
This relocalizing sounds rather abstract. So,
what is
it exactly what we should do, or what we should experiment with?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are certain situations which have to an extreme. Barcelona is one European example. Everything is a franchise, which has meant the killing of old family enterprises or younger family enterprises that are more recent. But the notion of truly a local economy that meets only some of the needs of the residents, but that is there. So now you see them, in the United States has always been a bit brutal about these kinds of things, and so they're dying, the local bank, the local this, the local that, etc., that kind of stuff. Because the notion is, what can we recirculate? The consumption capacity. I'm especially interested in modest neighborhoods, not the rich. The rich is, but what can you recirculate of that modest consumption capacity of each household and each other firm? What can recirculate in the neighborhood to sort of begin to build up once again neighborhood economies, more localized economies? Now, the United States has been brutal. Everything is a franchise, so it has killed. The other issue is a knowledge vector. So the flower shop. But flowers is, of course, a big enterprise here in this country. But the flower shop used to be a mom-and-pop shop in the U.S., where they actually had to know about what flowers, when was the best buyer, how is the accounting, what price do I... There was knowledge. It was a local, modest shop with modest knowledge, but there was knowledge. Now, when it's a franchise, the knowledge factor push out because it's with the headquarters, and they just, they're an intermediary sort of selling. I think that is a loss for every locality. So how do we recover the local intelligences and enable them? Because I think many people have given up. They say, the franchises take care of everything. Why should I? Well, how can we turn that around and enable, especially when you see that there are unemployed people in all our major cities.
But what should be the underlying values? Because a city like Amsterdam has made choices. I mean, for example, last week we received the medicine agency, we Hail Medicine Agency. They came after the Brexit to the Netherlands. there is this element of the city that wants to capitalize on its success.
But that is also part of the story. But that's why I'm talking about neighborhoods. You know, you have a huge central. I mean, Amsterdam is, and it's only going to get bigger. It's a major global center. Whether you know it or not, whether the buildings look like they have been there 500 years, how can it be global today? You know, I mean, no, it is. But that is one world that all these major cities have. And Amsterdam's is growing, as far as I can tell, very fast. So you have to go to another level. And one abstract way of putting it is the people's level, but that's a bit abstract. So I fall into the question of neighborhood, and I'm particularly interested in modest neighborhoods, which increasingly they are, you know, more and more of them. And I'm also particularly interested in the knowledge vector. So as I was telling you before, I think in any neighborhood, but certainly in a modest neighborhood, people should know not the jobs of their neighbors, their knowledge. Now, the US is extreme again, but we have doctors, you know, engineers who are waiting for their papers or whatever, and they may be cleaners. My job, I was an immigrant in the US. My first job was as a cleaning woman. I knew this is a momentary step for me, but that's what it was. And I was with a group of women who were all nurses from the Caribbean, and they also knew this is a moment. And then I move on to the next thing. So how about having, via digital stuff, that a neighborhood knows what are all the knowledges in my neighborhood, rather than what are the jobs that my neighbors have. The jobs can be very low level, but the knowledge is there. Or the grandmother who knows about herbs. You know, I'm just mentioning very, very simple examples, but this is most people in most cities, you know.
Yes, but that has not gone. It's still there. And maybe it's even thriving.
Well, that's great. That's good.
Yeah, everywhere.
Well,
I would
not
say.
everywhere. No, no, not true.
But
What are you talking about? What is thriving?
What do you mean?
Local knowledge.
Give us an example. I don't see it in our city.
You don't see it in the city. Well, it's a vibrant city. It's thriving. Lots of very small companies.
Well, that is great.
Micro,
that is great.
even micro multinationals you have in the city.
A micro multinational is
entrepreneurship. Yeah, it's really.
Is there someone who wants to comment on this and thinks, well, I need to add something to this now because some people. Yeah, I see someone there. There were two people. I saw two hands there. Yes.
I mean, all the small. That's fine, but
it's on.
There is also other spaces. I think that.
Well, you were asking about.
Is it on?
About Amsterdam and its current global position is a bit close.
Yeah, if you keep it a bit short, because usually people don't give it back.
I just wanted to give you some statistics that you were looking for. So currently in Amsterdam, there's 911,000 empty meters squared of office space. It is reduced, but this is an article from the Parool last week that I was really surprised about, because although this is a reduced figure, the city has decided that it's going to stop its pause on building office space. In fact, it's going to encourage more, which is really quite staggering, I think, because in 2014 or so, there was 8 million.
So you see the same trends he described about the empty office spaces.
And it's very, very clear to see. It's in the Zuidas, most of all.
Well, we started fighting it in 2006, and we were rather successful. So a city is able to fight all these kind of things. No, you don't think so?
There's also a question or a comment here. Yeah.
Yeah, so actually there is research done also at the UBA about precisely this thing, fighting empty office space. This was started some years ago. And they came to the conclusion that as a response, they tried this plot-based development of neighborhoods. And it turns out, well, it sounds all great and all the people are involved and blah, blah, blah. But in the end, it changes the social fabric of the city, because what happens and who is involved is middle-class people. And this actually brings me to a question, because how do you make sure when you involve the people that you don't have this not in my backyard kind of mentality that opposes structural changes that would be in the interest of the whole city and not just of the middle class that has the money anyway and engages in this new liberal logic?
So how do you really make inclusive engagement with the
Yes, because from what I understand from this research, and these are articles all from the last 1 or 2 years, like 2016, 17.
About the Netherlands.
Amsterdam, particular. Very interesting. I could send them to you if you want. So how do you...
Sorry?
Can you say something, Saskia, about this social fabric? How do you engage citizens? How do you get structural change to happen without just the middle class who already owe, well, maybe the political and the money?
First I need to clarify, because when I look at the statistics for a lot of the Western countries, with the US probably being an extreme case, the middle class existed as a real entity where sons and daughters would do better than their parents, that kind of modality, until about the 1970s in the case of the United States. After that, we begin to see a disaggregating of the middle class. For me, the middle class is no longer an operational concept if we're thinking of that older middle class. So we have two middle classes, one which is getting poorer and has understood that the sons and daughters will not do as well as the parents. They will not own houses, they will not blah, blah. And the other one is getting richer than they ever thought they would be. So that then creates a whole issue around certainly the housing question, where do you live? So a good part of the middle class, they are richer than they ever thought they would be. And they can buy anything. The problem is those who are losing. Same thing with the working class. There was a time when your organized working class had a better future than they do now. I understand that in the Netherlands on the health issue, people have lost, right? I have gotten a lot of letters from very angry Dutch people.
What did they say?
Especially about their parents, how their parents were horrified that they had lost on health care, that they had lost, losses, that they just get less money. And then finally, there seems to be a housing question issue. Again, Amsterdam, you know her better. Now, I want to come back to you, because your positive attitude I like, but when you say that look at all the nice, small, very fancy firms, that's not enough. You know what I mean? When you say because we have a lot of small, fancy firms. That's how Google started, right? Small, fancy, and then wow. And then they don't pay their taxes. But no, I just wonder, and again, you people are the experts, he and all of you, not me. But I wonder, I would be very surprised if we don't see this separating of a middle class, so that we have two types of middle classes. One that is just thriving, making more money than they ever thought.
And the other one is losing.
And the other one is losing. Yeah. And today in Manhattan, about 30% of the middle class is super rich. They're not the richest of the richest, but they are really rich. And I'm not talking about fancy university professors. They got graduated, $300,000, is a good salary. No, I'm talking much richer than that, but not, that concentration. So here I have gotten letters from people saying that the health care system is not what it used to be, that the housing question is not what it used to be. Now, I still have a very positive regard of the project that you're doing, because you are actually mobilizing citizens. And in the end, a city needs...
But then again, Steph, the question was not yet answered about how you engage not just the middle class, but how do you engage every layer of society, and not just the people who have the power and maybe also the capacities to be engaged?
Well, exactly, that's what we have to do.
How?
Sorry?
How?
Well, to begin with, I think you can do this at a city level. Yeah, cities are great organisms.
Yeah, I think one could.
Citizens have really still the feeling that they are citizens, that they are not just consumers, or that they are losing ground, and they have a voice. And you have to listen to them and bring them together and mobilize them,
but at the same time,
activate them.
It feels, not in a derogatory sense, but it feels so empty. I mean, the whole dynamic of Amsterdam is changing. If you read that Parool about the housing market, for example, there are these big things coming towards us, and you say organize, but I want to buy a house.
At the same time, I see huge programs in Pakhuizen Zwijger, here in the Balie. Everybody's now activated and is discussing things. I think
That's good.
the quality of the newspapers also is quite good. I see all the activities on social media.
Yeah. Yes.
So,
question here. Yes.
I would like to come back to the self-building plots that you mentioned. Yeah. I don't know which program you're talking about that is expanding. As a matter of fact, I work in housing. I don't see any new self-building plots happening in the city currently. But the one that was touted as the most successful one that happened, the one in Zuidoost, a couple of weeks ago in Parool, it said that all those people have already sold the houses again. And the fact that those people that bought those houses were
they never lived
that
in it.
upper middle class part of the city, and they were buying them in a very cheap area, or relatively cheap area of town. Mm-hmm. So I find that a prime example of gentrification, which is a result of the housing prices going up, which I think is a result of the kind of finance that Ms. Sassen is describing. So I find that a strange example of how it's going well. Could you explain how you see that?
Well, okay.
I want to...
This is about a huge modernist flat building in Amsterdam Southeast, which was always a poor area in the outskirts. And we wanted to tear it down, like so many of those buildings. But the housing corporation, who wanted to sell it and tear it down, decided to sell it for €1 to an organization, and they won prizes for this great project. Nobody believed that it would happen. It was really a miracle. We were very proud on it, but a few weeks ago we read that so many apartments have been sold and then we thought, what is going on here? What is going wrong? So I also read the newspapers, and I know this, but still, we have a lot of go to Buiksloterham, go to the Sloterplas. We still are selling plots. Amstelkwartier, all interesting neighborhoods. Yeah.
So there's been,
and I personally think that we should have far more of them.
Yeah, but we're building, right? We're having a building.
We should ask more of those self-built projects all over the city. So in the next elections, that would be a very important theme.
Yeah,
that double the amount of plots.
There's a comment question here.
Yeah, so there is a Dutch program called Anti-Squat, which has been working for some years, especially out in the outskirts of Amsterdam, because there wasn't much new buildings for residential purposes in Amsterdam. But I'm just wondering whether these kind of programs could be also used for office spaces that are being built and left on purpose, left empty. And maybe a law could be passed on to be able to identify those new buildings, and instead of letting them make money, just impose so that they would be occupied, so that they're not vandalized, or in this case, they're not extracted. These kind of things have been working perfectly for the housing market. Why wouldn't they work for the office market as well?
Saskia, is this something you see somewhere else? Does this happen?
Does what exactly happen?
Anti-squat?
That's our. That's
that's what it's called. But
that's
anti-squatting.
But the law that says you can't leave an office abandoned, you must use it.
Yeah.
And if you don't use it, well, then the law prohibits it.
Those are very specific, laws. Often they're old laws. That I know that both in New York and in London, many of them are just simply being, erased. One of the issues that I'm looking at is the contracts that are signed. And what you have is the encounter between a very state-of-the-art lawyering to the advantage of a big enterprise and old law that comes out of the city's history. And that encounter often means that the city loses. That is why today in London, a lot of what is presented as public space is privately owned. That's also happening in New York. So is it kind of a creep? The question of law, tomorrow I have to talk at the Hague Palace there, Palace of Peace, not the palace, the Palace of Peace. I forgot you have a queen, right? Or a king, you have a king.
Now we have
you have a king. I don't focus too much on that level. But there is a real, the question of the law really interests me here. And because there is a creep, I notice creeping when new law encounters old law often loses. And old law often is much more geared towards the notion of the city as an entity, rather than individual firms. That is very important. So that to me is an issue. So I don't have a clear answer to your question because I don't know the situation here. But what I do know is that, first, I completely agree with your positive sense, in the sense that let's recover more and more housing for modest classes. So there is a battle to be fought, right? On the other hand, I also do think that we need to change some laws, at least in the countries that I know. I don't know what that is like here. So the law for me has become a critical tool, and it's getting used critically often by corporations. They are really inventing attachments, to existing law, which are to their advantage. And we, the citizens, are completely out of that game. That's a pity.
Yeah. There's one question here, and then I come to you. I come to the back afterwards. We have 15 minutes. Where was your question? Who shouted it?
I love where was your
it was
question?
not your question. Yeah, we come to the back afterwards. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Heidi Jane. Thank you, Ms. Sassen. I came especially to hear your take on the Amsterdam situation. And I've been listening so far. Also, Mr. Hemele. I was quite happy with that you said that there is some activation going on in the Netherlands, yet I didn't clearly understand what actually is your plan. Maybe it's possible to give a short abbreviation for those who don't know what it actually is, so I get more of an idea. But my question is that between the two of you, the debate is going on mostly about the extremely rich middle class and the not so rich but normal, the old-fashioned middle class. But how about the normal people, those who work for their jobs and who get more and more into the neoliberal situation of becoming more and more working poor? And that is also, like these dark towers, is another challenging situation in our days and our time. I would like to hear a little bit more about that. Okay. Especially also because, sir, you say we have to activate the people. The people are active. They want to do something. But the question is, how can we transform the United States tradition of organizing, especially when it comes to law? You were talking about the laws, the legislational part. How to get that here? Are you willing, mister, to work with us to really get it going here?
Okay.
Because we need that.
So, two questions. Maybe the last one first. Are you really willing, mister, to do this?
Yeah. Well, it's very, very easy to be negative and to be critical. But I'm very proud of this city, the way the citizens and also the city council acts and reacts on all those processes. Let me give you one example. The university for which I'm working, the University of Amsterdam, it owns a huge amount of real estate in the city center, in the old center, and it wants to build a new campus. This might take 5, maybe even 10 years to do it, and it has decided to develop this whole project on a temporary base for students' housing, for the coming 5 or 10 years. And I'm very proud of my university that they do things like this. So this is one of the institutions. I gave the other example of the kantorenloods. So this team of people of the municipality working now since 2006 on the transformation of vacant office space, and they are rather successful. It's huge. And I also gave the example of the self-built plots. Then we have all those temporary projects like Marineterrein and Tolhuistuin and the Keuvel. These are all projects where the city collaborates with citizens.
So actually what you're saying, it's not all pitch black, there are things happening, you should also look at that.
Yeah, be proud of your city. It's
But then lastly, before I come to her, she also said something about not just focusing on the middle class, but also the lower class, because we're talking about self-building plots. Well, that's usually not from the lower class. There are people from the middle class who do that.
No. In New West, also the lower classes, Turkish and Moroccan, they are also now building. They have this culture of self-built houses. No. Well, if you. No, don't make them powerless. Don't do this. Don't do this. So believe in their. Well, they are new middle-class people. Yeah, they entered this city when they were very poor, and now they are middle-class and they are active.
Sorry.
Yeah, you get to ask your question.
I had two brief questions. One relates to the previous one. Ms. Sassen, do you think, in the face of these empty towers, it's worth it to reinstate real squatter rights? Because I think in the Netherlands it's forbidden to squat at the moment.
A few years, yeah.
And the other question is, the Netherlands being a tax haven for big foreign companies, do you think this increases our risk of foreign companies buying up large amounts of property?
Thank you.
Well, let me say that the Netherlands is a very advanced economy, and that has both very good things and also these negatives at this extreme, right? I mean, what I'm talking about here does not happen, say, in Jordan, though it might get there. Who knows what they do? They financialize the refugee camps. I don't know, but... now, I also want to say that, so the Netherlands is, I would say, a bit at risk of becoming a haven for all kinds of things, like London has been, and like in some ways New York City and some other cities in the US too. We are, the Paradiso, you just saw Paradiso, right, the data. That is obscene. That is not just criminal and violation of the spirit of the law, even though in the case of the Paradiso, there was enormous care by the lawyers and the accountants to keep it all sort of outside of the criminality zone. But still, you look at it and you say, this is just not right. Tax avoidance, at a scale. So we have an extraordinary amount of very powerful actors who simply are in full violation. Apple, an admirable company, etc. Two problems that are never mentioned: the tax bit, the evasion, and the other one is all the electronic garbage, right? It's like the iPhone, and so we, each of these major actors has problematic long tails with long time effects. I do think that what I like about what you're saying is the city, for me, the city is one of the few spaces in today's world where most of the land, agricultural land, etc., is now private. When we look through the satellite, it looks like there is a lot of empty land. No, it's all owned by the Coca-Colas and the Nestlés, by the mines, by the whatever. So the city to me, is a working city, and all these cities that I'm talking about are working cities, no matter the inequalities, no matter the abuses. A city is a space, one of the few spaces left where those without power get to make a history, a little history, an economy, a neighborhood economy, and a politics. Or again, a specific politics, besides the grand. I want to protect that. And the housing question hangs in there, If you eliminate from the beating heart of the city and you push them further and further out, we're losing something about this critical function that cities have. So, and my new project is a project that I call, for now, ethics in the city. I am sick and tired of all these I don't want to offend anybody here, these beautiful texts on the ethical that keep hanging well above the level of the city. Idealizations. What does it mean to have an ethics in the city where inevitably you're going to have inequalities? Inequalities are built into the city. And so, there are two issues here. One is that the city is a place where those without power get to make a history. And I grew up in Latin America, the poor, the fighting poor, not the destroyed, etc. poor, the fighting poor, their phrase, estamos presentes, we're present. This is also our city. Not, government help me, I want more. No, we are present. And I think some of the projects that you're doing have that quality too. It is not about everybody becoming equally rich. No, there are so many other things. So in this project, Ethics in the City, one first little step that I'm looking at is I'm going to very poor neighborhoods in major cities that I know well, and asking, what is it that really you find unacceptable? Because I don't think we know. I think we assume. But what I'm hearing from these people are certain things they say, look, I can accept this, which is a kind of injustice, an acceptance of an unjust situation. What I cannot accept is that. And so I'm really interested in mapping. What would it mean to develop the notion of an ethics in the city, which inevitably is not going to be beautiful and perfect, but we need that knowledge. We don't even have that knowledge, because out of that can also come projects where you enable. And I know so many immigrants in New York City who are actually rather happy. They're not rich, and their sons and daughters are not doing as well as they were hoping. But there is something about life. They have the little shop. They have, they have something where they are makers. Their talents, are. Yeah. And then you have others. Okay, so I speak too long. I just got carried away.
It's really interesting. It's just a point of order, because we need to get you to another city in The Hague. Yeah. So we have 7 more minutes.
And I need a drink.
And I want a few more questions. There's some water next to you, and we'll get you some wine. But first, I come to you. Right? I promised. Yeah.
There's no perfect city.
There is no.
No, it cannot be.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I first have a comment on Mr. Hemel, and then I will go to the question of Mrs. Sassen.
Keep it short, not for the sake of interesting, but
for Mr. Hemel, I just want to rephrase a very bad politician of the last 30, 40 years, and it's not to Sef Hemel to give a solution for our problems. The way Sef Hemel thinks is the problem. The way you talk about gentrification, the way you talk about policy development in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, is a kind of typical top-down, white middle-class professor or higher class professor.
Okay. I think
the question to Mr. Sassen is...
No, I want to say something, because I think you have every right to make that point, but I think there's also the fact that Sef Hemel is someone who is coming here and has a really great array of expertise. Well, I just want to say that. You can say that what he says is not good, but the white middle-aged professor...
He's mistaken.
Well, that's but just, okay, proceed with your question.
My very simple question is to Mrs. Sassen is, do you have some examples of cities you have been visiting or researching on gentrification and struggle against gentrification, which you can say are an example for Amsterdam?
Okay, good question.
I wish, also every city is so different. But so there is a kind of gentrification, so the language also is problematic. There's a kind of gentrification that means upgrading. you know, where the locals do that. Immigrants have been famous for that. But in the case of the immigrant communities, then those immigrants stay in there. They have brought it up, you know, they have made it better, and then it's their other modes of gentrification lead to, you know, those who cured it a bit being expelled because the prices go too high. So it's just very difficult to have a general sort of statement about what is happening in our cities, because every city is a bit different. Did I sort of answer your question or not? Not really? Later. When I'm having my class. What?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
My question has to do, I'm trying to think about what you were talking about, the logic of extraction, what is happening, for instance, in London, where, as I see it very simplistically, basically buildings are being emptied, and so the value is going abroad to other countries. And another term that has been mentioned a couple of times, gentrification, where it's often begins with actually very local people, artists, makers that go to an area. And so you're actually more adding instead of extracting.
Yes.
But this addition, it actually creates value that can afterwards then be financialized.
Exactly.
But these little shops, these makers, these artists, this is actually the local that has also been mentioned as the kind of the savior. And so how can we kind of avoid romanticizing this local and making evil the multinational? Trying to think about how the local actually very much function within a global system as well, and the other way around. So trying to think
just very, very quickly. Look, you're absolutely right in what you said. You know, there is really the city, which is such an important space for us humans because we are, you know, is a highly imperfect space. Now, I want to mention one thing that I didn't mention, which to me is interesting. So, when you look at systems of power, as I have done, across long periods, long historical periods, most of them are finished, dead. You know, they keep re-emerging, new forms, etc. What has survived across different historic epochs is urban space, including, importantly, the space of the modest people in a city. And to me, that carries meaning, you know. And that is what I was getting at also with my ethics in the city. Inevitably, inequality is part. Inevitably, there are some gentrifications which are good, like artists in Zurich recovered whole areas, and now they're being expelled, you know, from those areas to go on the other side of some river, and so they can, you know, mobilize. That is a brutal story that is happening everywhere. I think the city is a space where all these brutalities, you know, we have to notice them. If we are in a little, whatever, private zone, we don't. At the same time, historically speaking, most residents in the cities have actually been low-income people, in many of our cities, for sure. And their histories are still with us, you know, and they are still, every generation brings a new set of those people. So there is something about the city that is, number one, highly imperfect, number two, has a durability that beats out so many other far more formalized and powerful systems. Number three has been, for many people, the city has been a space where the families can do better, the next generation, blah, blah. Today's moment is a very peculiar moment for a certain set of cities. But I do think that when you look at most cities in the world, or in a country like the Netherlands, you don't have the kinds of issues that I was talking about. I was talking about an extreme condition, also to illustrate something about the way our economic system is working. But I want to emphasize that most cities in the United States are not what I described, you know that. So there is some, I want us to keep the positive of the city, but the city is a messy zone because of all the inequalities. And finally, we cannot give up in every new generation, every new moment, in a situation like you are here doing, and I am in New York. it's also a zone for contesting, for battling, for making demands, for making reclamations in a way that if you're working in a mine is a very different story, very difficult to do, right? So the city is a space for activisms and for, you know, besides all the other things that it is. So I'm trying to bring in a somewhat positive note, accepting.
We've allowed the cancer of relativism to infect us, so we think there are no shared universal values, and there is no freedom without those shared universals.
Vrijheid is iets wat je niet kan waarderen wanneer je het helemaal hebt. Je moet het een tijdje niet hebben en dan pas begrijp je wat je mist.
Reverse the question. Can art destroy the world? And I think it can. You can choose either to be abused or not.
The political news is robust. The safety of journalists.
We hacked into the audience, and then all of a sudden 300 phones would ring, you know.
Good evening, everybody. Warm welcome. Welcome in the Balie. Great that you're all here with so many people on your free Wednesday night, just before the December activities commence. You've all chosen to be here on your free night. I think you've chosen rightly so, because this is a special night also for me. My name is Tim Wagemakers. I'm program editor at the Balie. And across the year, you get to hear many people speak. And while you hear interesting stuff all the time, there are very rare moments when you get the chance to meet people that are like, well, a bit the seismographs of our time. They are able to feel the pulse of where we come from. They can say something about where we are right now. And if you listen really carefully, you can also get a glimpse of where we're heading in the future, maybe, or some scenarios. And one of these persons is Saskia Sassen, who is here tonight. She just flew in this morning from New York, so thank you, Saskia, for making this work in your schedule. Really happy that you're here. And you are all part of the series Long Live Amsterdam, or in Dutch, Leve Amsterdam. This is the second edition, actually. Last month we had Evgeny Morozov talking about how technologies shape the city. Next month we have former mayor of Bristol, George Ferguson, talking about the resilient city. How can a city cope with all the big transformations that are coming towards them? And tonight we have Saskia Sassen. And I think her story is more relevant than ever for Amsterdam. Because if you talk about Amsterdam, I don't know how it is with you, but sometimes you get the feeling that people fear that people are being expelled from the city. The question is, who is able to live in the city, and who, moreover, more important, is able not to live in the city anymore. And when we take as a fact that Amsterdam is growing the coming years, what trends, what systemic edges are there, and how can we analyze them in terms of those